Welcome to the case for hiring people with disabilities in the workplace. What are the myths and what does the research show? Thank you for joining us today. This webinar is part of our Harnessing Talent Alliance series. My name is Yusra Benjeloun, Administrative Coordinator and Project Manager with the Work Wellness and Disability Prevention Institute, and I'll be co-moderating the webinar today. This webinar is made possible through the support of the Community Gaming Grant Program through the BC Government, Employment and Social Development Canada, as well as donations and memberships to WWDPI. We thank our program partners, Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work, Education Advisory Committee, and speakers who contribute to this webinar series. While we're waiting for others to join us, I'll go over a few technical points for the webinar. You should be able to hear the presentation through your computer speakers or through the conference call line if you dialed in. Please use the question box to submit any issues you may be experiencing and to ask any questions you have related to the presentation. We will collect questions submitted throughout the presentation and follow it with a Q&A based on the questions submitted. Any questions not answered will be answered and distributed after the event. The presentation will be recorded and posted for free on our website within a week along with the slides. You will be emailed the direct links for all of these items when they're available. Today's webinar will be co-moderated by Maureen Han, President and CEO of the Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work. The Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work focuses on supporting job seekers with disabilities and employers across Canada. Maureen will be running our Q&A session and we'll let her introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Silvia Bonaccio.
Thank you so much, Yusra. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Silvia Bonaccio. She is the Ian Telfer Professor of Workplace Psychology at the Telfer School of Management, University of Ottawa. Dr. Bonaccio earned a PhD in Industrial Organizational Psychology from Purdue University. She also holds a Master in Science from Concordia University's John Molson School of Business and a BA in Psychology from McGill University. Dr. Bonaccio conducts partnered research with people living with disabilities, employment service providers, and workplaces. Her other stream of research focuses on the influence of anxiety and emotions in the personnel assessment and selection process. Dr. Bonaccio's research is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. Her work has been published in journals such as the Journal of Management, Organizational Behavior and Human Decision Processes, Journal of Organizational Behavior, Journal of Occupational Behavior, and Journal of Business Ethics. She is Associated Editor at Personnel Assessment and Decisions, and she is on the editorial board at the Journal of Business and Psychology and the Journal of Behavioral Decision Making. Dr. Bonaccio is the founding director of Telfer's PhD in Management program. I look forward to hearing everything that you have to say today. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Maureen, for this kind introduction, and hello, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here today, and thank you so much to everyone who's taking some time out of their busy day to join us for this webinar. Over the next little while, I'd like to share information drawn from our research on the participation of people with a lived experience of a disability in the workplace. Our research seeks to answer some of the most common concerns and questions that managers have about employing a person with a lived experience. And we seek to respond to these concerns by taking what is known as an evidence-based approach. This means that we use research evidence and empirical data to respond to questions that managers, business leaders, and any and all organizational decision makers might have about people with disabilities in the workplace. I want to acknowledge that this is work that I don't do alone. I do it with wonderful colleagues at the Canadian Disability Participation Project. My colleagues, Dr. Catherine Connolly, Ian Gelletley, Arif Jetha, and Kathleen Martin-Guinness are all represented in the work that I'll be discussing today. So my plan for today and my goal for today is really to address misinformation that managers often have about workers with disabilities. And I'll be addressing misinformation pertaining to recruitment, employee selection and staffing decisions, misinformation related to accommodations, as well as performance management. I'll be spending a lot more time of this webinar on the early portion of the employment process, so the recruitment and the selection, because that's where the initial barriers to participation are located. If we can't break down the barriers at the recruitment and at the selection stage, then the rest of the employment process doesn't even have the opportunity to unfold. So it's really important to address misinformation that prevents people from joining an organization in the first place. But I'll also talk about accommodations, which are often essential and they permeate the entire employment process, as well as performance management, because there's a lot of misinformation that happens at that step as well. I want this webinar to be practical, and so throughout the presentation, I've included some practical tips that are denoted by this kind of orange arrow or bullet style. And my hope for these is that you'll have some practical takeaways, some tangible takeaways that either help you and lead you on a reflection journey of your current practices in your organization, or perhaps they're things that you can implement right away in your own workplace. I do want to note that many of these arrows will point you to information that is found on external websites. And because organizations' websites are not static, if you're happen to be listening and joining this webinar at a later date and you follow the link and you find that it's no longer active, I found that one useful way to recover the page is to use the website's own search tool function, and that will help you recover the page when links have changed. I believe the technical term for this is called link rot. My IT colleagues have told me this. Okay, at the bottom of the slide, you also have the full reference to our paper. And a lot of the information that I'll be going through today is found in this paper, but in a lot more detail than what we can do in the format of a webinar. And it was really important for us to publish this paper in a way that made it accessible. And so we published the paper in open access format. This means that the paper is freely available from the journal's website, and you can download it by following the link in orange at the bottom of the slide. And that's a permanent link, so it's not going to change. And you can download the paper, you can share it as freely as you wish. We wrote the paper in the spirit of informing both practice and science. And so in the paper, we've included a lengthy table containing links to several dozen resources that are found online that employers might find useful, in addition to some fairly lengthy discussions of each of the steps of the employment process, providing information to employers who might also find that information useful as they reflect on their own employment practices. All right, so I wanted to start with a little bit of background. I wanted to give a little bit of information on the employment landscape. In Canada, people with disabilities continue to be the most underrepresented equity-seeking group in organizations. And this finding was recently published in a Conference Board of Canada report, and you have the hyperlink at the bottom of the screen. This was, the landscape continues to not change very much. We know that over 20% of working age Canadians report living with a disability, and this is from the results of the latest Canadian Survey on Disability that was published last year at about this time. And in addition, close to 650,000 Canadians living with a disability and who have the potential to work and want to work are currently unemployed. This translates into a fairly significant employment rate disparity. The employment rate is 80% for people without a lived experience versus 59% for people with a lived experience. And in a few slides, we'll talk about situations of underemployment. And so this employment rate disparity doesn't consider even underemployment where people are working below their qualification level. So for those of us joining us from other countries outside of Canada, what about other countries? Well, the data are actually quite similar. And the best quote that I can provide is the following from Heyman and colleagues in their very, very good book, Disability and Equity at Work, from the opening chapter. They say the following: the bottom line is that all over the world, a person with a disability is less likely to be employed than a person without a disability, often much less so. So this means that there are barriers to employment participation. There are barriers of employment quantity as well as quality. If we think about employment quantity, this is a situation where a person is not working, but they would like to be employed, and they have the capacity to be employed and the desire to be employed. If we think about quality participation, the barriers to or poor employment quality would be situations of, for example, involuntary part-time employment. Somebody wants to be employed full-time, but they're forced into part-time work. Involuntary contract work when a permanent position would be preferred. All sorts of precarious work situations, as well as, and quite importantly, work that is below one's qualification level. These barriers to employment participation really often stem from managers, from employers, from any organizational decision maker, lack of information. And often this lack of information translates into negative attitudes and unfavorable decisions. And so it's really important to think about how we can enact change. And in my research group, we argue that one of the ways in which, as researchers, we can enact change is through data. We can use data to inform and influence. We can inform managers, we can influence decision makers, but we can also use data to make all the wonderful success stories that, that people have through their professional experience much more powerful. And so part of our goal as researchers is to use data to be able to equip HR specialists and job developers to provide this data so that they can augment their success stories with evidence-based management information. And evidence-based management is simply using data to be able to inform management decisions so that the decisions are made according to best practices. So if we think about the barriers, where are the barriers located? When we're writing our paper, we came up with this figure, and we wanted a visual representation of the entire employment process, and breaking down the employment process to be able to pinpoint each and every step of the way and where the barriers to employment participation might exist. And so we start with the pre-employment, the recruitment, and attraction. Then moving on to selection, the social life in the organization, and then performance management, with, of course, accommodations being one of the processes that allow often the whole employment process to unfold. And so, as promised, I'll be spending a lot of time in these two quadrants, the recruitment and the selection, and then talking a little bit about performance management. Okay, so, well, let's start with recruitment. At the recruitment stage, there's quite a few myths that managers may believe in as it pertains to employees or job candidates with a lived experience. One of the myths that is quite recurrent is the low number of people with disabilities applying for jobs. In fact, that Kay and colleagues article, and you have the full reference at the bottom of the slide for those of you who would be interested in it. The title of this paper is "Why Don't Employers Hire and Retain Workers with Disabilities?" And one of the quotes from this paper was, quote, that managers rarely see people with disabilities in applicant pools. And this idea of, you know, if you don't see, well, the folks with disabilities are just not in your applicant pool, couldn't be further from the truth. Well, we know that 20% of working Canadians report living with a disability. If we look at US data, some of the most recent figures suggest roughly 16%. In the paper, we report very similar figures from the Netherlands, Australia, UK, and Sweden. And so these numbers are fairly stable across the world. And what these numbers mean is that equating disability with a visible personal characteristic is incorrect. There are many invisible disabilities that people report living with. So if we think about invisible disabilities, these are a wide range of physical and psychological conditions that often have no visible manifestation, or perhaps they have visible features that are not clearly connected to a disability. And my colleagues, Alicia Santuzzi and her co-authors, do some really interesting and essential work on the topic of invisible disabilities and disability identity. And so we can think about the many invisible disabilities that people might report living with. For example, depression and anxiety. These are some of the most common mental health challenges. We can think of arthritis, for example, or diabetes, a person who's deaf or hard of hearing, and the many chronic conditions in which a person's well-being fluctuates, perhaps on a daily basis, you know, feeling better earlier in the day, less so at the end of the day, or on a weekly basis, feeling better early in the week, less so at the end of the week. So all of these kind of show the diversity that's inherent in the idea of invisible disabilities. Of course, if we're thinking about invisible disabilities, one of the topics that can come up is the idea of disclosure. In fact, disclosure is an incredibly deeply personal decision. It's the decision of when is right to disclose one's disability, to whom to disclose, an employer, a colleague, perhaps a direct report, or disclosing to HR, how much or how little information to disclose. And disclosure is a very difficult decision, in part because applicants and employees often fear negative career repercussions. And unfortunately, the concerns surrounding disclosures are valid. There is evidence that some managers might discriminate against individuals with disabilities once they disclose or at least make different employment decisions based on disability status, and of course that's not legal. However, there's evidence that does sometimes happen. And disclosure is a little bit of it's a very tricky situation because there's also evidence that managers react negatively to a later disclosure, even when late simply means noting one's disability at the end of an interview instead of the beginning. And so disclosure really has to be a personal decision of disclosing when and if the time is right for the person. There's also evidence that some workers, and especially younger ones, may prefer not to disclose because they don't want to feel different from their peers. And my colleague Arif Jetha has some really good work on this topic. And sometimes the disclosure concern is just the fact that this is personal information and we'd rather not disclose it in a workplace. So because of all of these concerns, many applicants with disabilities may forego disclosing unless an accommodation is necessary, and some may even forego disclosure if it means withholding an accommodation request when the fear of negative career repercussions outweighs in somebody's mind the necessity and the benefits of asking for accommodations. Okay, so I promised some practical tips, and so here's a first set of practical information. When the need for information and the lack of awareness that fuels the myth of low number of people with disabilities comes from a lack of awareness, here are 4 websites that have some really good information. The CCRW, the Canadian Council for Rehabilitation and Work, has a module on the ABCs of disability. Hire for Talented has some fact sheets on disabilities as part of their toolkits. These first 2 websites have information that is written in a very accessible, plain language way, and that would be just wonderful to kickstart discussions around equity, diversity, inclusion of folks with a lived experience in the workplace. The next 2 websites, Ask Earn and Ask Jan, have information that's a little bit more in depth. Earn is the Employer Assistance and Resource Network on Disability Inclusion. It is run through the U.S. Department of Labor, and Earn is a wonderful source of information. It's a centralized resource for education and training on disability inclusion. Although it is developed in the US, the information is available to users around the world. For example, EARN has modules on language, on etiquette, the notion of people first. It also has modules on disclosure and self-identification, as well as a lengthy library of webinars. And so it's a really important resource to have bookmarked and to consult whenever needed. Ask Jan. Jan is the Job Accommodation Network. It provides expert consulting and guidance on workplace accommodations and disability employment issues. For anybody joining us from the US, Jan is an amazing resource because it is a free service for US-based employers. Jan is funded by a contract from the US Department of Labor, the Office of Disability and Employment Policy. We'll talk about Jan in a few slides, but just to foreshadow, the Job Accommodation Network has a lengthy amount of information on many different disabilities, as well as functional limitations, as well as an internal search engine that allows users to track down potential accommodations according to disability or functional limitation. And so again, just like EARN, although Jan was developed for the US market, its information is available broadly to anybody visiting the website. If the questions are more on the statistics, here are 2 external resources. Disabilitystatistics.org is provides data for the US. This is state level data as well as national data. And then the second link, the Canadian Survey on Disabilities, the latest release by Statistics Canada, and quite a bit of information that is potentially very interesting to employers. So the spirit of these resources is really to help employers, hiring managers, business leaders to become more knowledgeable. And in turn, knowledge really helps build confidence for individual managers and business leaders. And this knowledge in many ways can help build the workplace up to become more disability confident. So let's take a look at a second myth. The second myth is that many managers believe that recruiting people with disabilities is hard. But we know that people with disabilities form one of the largest underutilized labor pools. And in fact, a lot of businesses are just foregoing a great and important source of competitive advantage by not recruiting proactively from this labor pool. So here are a couple of thought exercises that might be of use in your daily practices and in your organizations. Whenever I hear a manager saying that recruiting is hard, my first thought, and I engage in this discussion with them, is, well, might it be that applicants are actually discouraged from applying to your organization? And so here are a couple of questions. What messages are your recruitment materials sending? So for example, do you name diversity groups in your recruitment texts, in your statements about equity, diversity, inclusion, in other value statements in your organization, on your website, for example? A study of value statements of many organizations in the Fortune 500 list found that organizations often forget to list people with a lived experience. And this is, I believe, just unwittingly forgetting. There is no malice, but very often when businesses think about equity, diversity, and inclusion, unfortunately, folks with the lived experience of a disability may not be included as part of that EDI discussion. So what signals are you sending? Where are you posting the recruitment ads? Are you reaching a broad audience? So when you're thinking about posting the ads on a variety of job boards online, is Work Inc., for example, one of the job boards where you might be posting? Work Inc. is a job site that is hosted by CCRW. It's accessible to both employers and job seekers. And I would really hope that that is one of the websites where the job ads are being posted on a regular basis. The third question is to think, how accessible are the recruitment processes? Are there any barriers? Some job sites may have poor accessibility features. If you are outsourcing the recruitment to an external organization, for example, if one is hiring temporary workers, are you having discussions with the organization you're outsourcing to, as well as any vendors of recruitment tools that you're buying around accessibility? And are you testing out the features to make sure that there are no barriers in the recruitment process? And then finally, and I would say perhaps most importantly, thinking about the policies and guidelines that are encouraging diverse recruitment and hiring at your organization. And this is really important because there's work showing that the policies are more predictive of actual hiring decisions than only relying on managers' own good intentions. And so managers might want to recruit and hire diverse applicants, but the policies at the level of the organizations must be there to support managers in their equity, diversity, and inclusion vision. And so from a business perspective, It's important to say that the business values equity, diversity, inclusion, but it's even more important to signal what exactly is meant. How is equity, diversity, and inclusion reflected in day-to-day activities that guide recruitment and hiring? And so some of the examples that I gave for the previous bullet points would be examples of the signals that are being given from that support EDI activities. So making sure that the recruitment process is barrier-free, for example. Okay, so more resources, again, to support and break down the myth that recruitment is hard. There are quite a few webinars that are devoted to recruitment, and these webinars are freely accessible. So, for example, the long list of the WWDPI webinars, as well as the library that Ask Earn hosts. In particular, the one that I would point to is the webinar by Ask Earn on building the pipeline for recruiting and hiring people with disabilities. And one of the ways that you could consider using these webinars is as part of a training and development, either a lunch and learn or an afternoon activity where your team watches the webinar, but then there's a discussion and there's an action plan that is built based on the knowledge from the webinar so that you can implement some of these ideas locally. Another idea, and this is something that a lot of businesses are just unaware of the resources that are available, but it's to partner with expert organization whose mission is focused on creating a bridge between job seekers and employers. And of course, the work of the organizations goes way beyond that initial connection to support the employment relationship. And these are two organizations that are very dear to my heart. So CCRW, Maureen, your organization, does such wonderful work. And then for anybody joining us from Alberta, Gateway Association, one of our research partners, also does amazing work in terms of job developing. So those are our two ideas. And then finally, partnering with local colleges and universities, using co-op placements and internships. If a business is new to hiring folks with a lived experience, and of course they might have in the past, they just didn't know, but for businesses that are just not quite very confident yet, partnering with universities and colleges and seeking out co-op or internship students can be a really great confidence building avenue towards making organizations more inclusive in their hiring. And one of the great benefits of internships and co-op terms is that they come with support from the college and university. And the students who participate in these programs have shown to be really the cream of the crop. These are motivated students, they're smart, they have done well in their courses because often co-op terms come with minimum averages that the students need to meet. And so these are just some ideas. And here's a link to one university in Ottawa, just down the street from the University of Ottawa. My colleagues at Carleton have this program, co-op and internship program for students with disabilities and matching employers to these wonderful students. All of these resources really seek to kind of target the risk aversion that a lot of organizations feel. A lot of organizations want to minimize risks, and hiring through partners in the community can help conditions that reassure employers. In part, these are applicants that are brought forward who have already been screened to have a good match between themselves and the job requirements. So the employers get to meet talented individuals that meet their employment needs. And there's also the added benefit of the support from the expert organization or the co-op office at the college or the university. All right. So let's change gears a little bit and move on to selection. And again, as I promised, we'll be spending more time on recruitment and selection than the other two topics. Okay, so at the selection stage, at this point, hopefully you'll have recruited broadly many wonderful candidates who meet your job requirements, and at the selection stage, this is the time to make decisions in terms of extending offers of employment or not, or moving folks forward in the selection process if it happens to be a multiple step process. One of the most common myths at this point that managers express, and these are concerns that are expressed, are around the qualification of people with disabilities. The reality is that many disabilities continue to be stigmatized, and a common stereotype is one that equates disabilities with lack of abilities. And this is incredibly problematic in an employment context, because in an employment context, the focus has to be on abilities. It has to be on the knowledge, the skills, and the talents that a candidate brings to the organization. And so a focus on abilities is the key to successful selection decisions. So the very nature of this myth and the myth emphasizing a lack of ability stands in contrast to the nature of the role that all workers are expected to fulfill in an organization. This being said, census data shows that people with and without disabilities are often quite similar, and much more similar than the myth suggests, on important markers of employability. So the questions or the food for thought here that I have for listeners is to think about the essential job requirements and to match those job requirements to the applicant's knowledge, skills, abilities, and to do so for all applicants. This means that it's really important for organizations to have up-to-date job analyses and job descriptions. And the reality is that many organizations don't have up-to-date information. And so when we're recruiting for a job or for a position, does the job description, is it still accurate? Is it up to date? Does it still match how the job is carried out? Jobs evolve over time, technology changes, client bases change as well. And so thinking about reviewing that information with a critical eye to make sure that it is up to date and it is still accurate, distinguishing between the essential characteristics of the job, the tasks that are critical, that are performed all the time in that position, and then the tasks that aren't essential to that particular job. For the positions where college or university degrees are required, again, partnering with a local institution to facilitate the identification of qualified applicants. And the idea here is really to hire for a good match between the essential elements of the job and the candidate's skills. And that becomes the key. Related to this myth is a second one for selection. And the myth here is that the selection process will be more difficult. The myth is fueled by the fact that many managers and business leaders are often not trained in the best practices of employee selection in general, or their training is many, many, many years ago. And so just in general, selection is something that can be tricky, especially in organizations that don't benefit from an HR department to support these activities. And in addition, many managers are not disability confident, in particular in the context of selection. And this lack of disability knowledge is reported both by managers themselves, but also by employees and job candidates with a lived experience. Very often managers report that they're simply worried about doing or saying the wrong thing. And so what this points to is really a need for more training and more information. And training and information is widely available. So here are 2 toolkits that are available: Ask Earn, focus on the interviews, as well as Hire for Talent. And I've provided links for interviews because interviews are the most common selection tool. It's quite rare for an organization not to use interviews or somebody to be hired without either a face-to-face or a remote interview. This really is the most commonly employed selection tool. So making sure that managers are well trained in the best practices of interview. And often managers are not. So for example, a common misunderstanding and lack of knowledge is that hiring managers believe that conversational style interviews are better predictive of how somebody is likely to perform on the job. And so just having a conversation with somebody, asking questions, and having that gut feeling about an applicant will be more predictive. And in fact, the research shows that that is not at all the case. Structured interviews are far more predictive of future job performance. And structured interviews also help safeguard against biased decisions. The Riley and colleague paper looked at safeguarding structured interviews, safeguarding against biased decisions in the context of applicants with a disability. But the same finding has been shown for structured interviews, helping safeguard against other types of unconscious bias, for example, unconscious bias related to gender. So structured interviews are the ones where interviewers ask the same pre-established questions to all candidates. The questions are asked in the same manner. Often the probes are even listed so that each candidate receive the same kind of probes. And most importantly, applicants' answers are evaluated against a standardized scoring key that has been developed thinking about the job requirements as opposed to that gut reaction that the unstructured interview calls for. So here again, when we're thinking about the concern that the selection process will be more difficult, it really is all too often a lack of information, a lack of knowledge that a lot of business leaders haven't had an opportunity to develop, and then it translates into these concerns and a lack of confidence. Okay, so let's move on to the accommodations. At the accommodation stage, if I had to pick the #1 myth surrounding accommodations, in my experience, it would be the myth of the cost of accommodations. It is one of the most common concerns that employers report having. Managers all too often think that accommodations are going to be expensive and they're going to be complicated. And the reality is that they don't have to be either of those two things. In fact, the Job Accommodation Network has tracked accommodation costs since 2004. So we have about 15 years worth of data. They've surveyed over 2,000 employers across industries and business sizes, and they found that more than half of the accommodations that they recommended to their client organizations and that were implemented successfully were cost-free. And when a cost is incurred, the majority of their client organizations reported a one-time cost of under $500. So for anybody joining us who has an interest in learning more about this analysis of costs, the hyperlink from askjan.org is on this slide. And so in addition to this idea that accommodations are actually more often than not inexpensive, I would really want us to change the conversation around accommodations. In fact, accommodations are frequently requested by workers without disabilities. Work by Susan Briere and her colleagues shows that up to 95% of accommodations in organizations are provided for reasons other than an accommodation for a disability. In fact, it's important to think about that because the same accommodations are often requested by workers with and without disabilities, and there are no differences in cost or implementation. For example, flexible work arrangements are the most common accommodation that's requested by workers with and without disabilities. So flexibility in scheduling, flexibilities in the way in which somebody performs their work. So we can think of, for example, parents of young children often require flexibility in schedules in the morning and the afternoon to coordinate school drop-offs and pickups. Well, the same flexibility can be quite important for somebody who travels via adapted transportation. But for some reason, when managers are asked for that flexibility in schedule, if it's asked by for work-family balance reason, it seems that that request goes into one pile. And if it's asked for accommodation for a disability reason, it seems that this request goes into a different pile and it's thought about in a very different way. And so I really want us to change the conversation around accommodations. Not equating accommodations with disability and instead thinking of accommodations as practices that support every employee. Accommodations are sometimes called productivity enhancers, and I would really like this language to be used more often because all employees can use some work adjustments, some productivity enhancers to help them be their best selves at work. And so we really have to change the conversation around accommodations to help remove the stigma that often accompanies accommodations. Equally importantly, when managers are so concerned about the costs of accommodations, they also often forget to look at the benefits of accommodations. And so if the conversation is around costs and balance sheets, then really encouraging managers and business leaders to break down the benefits of accommodations. Those should also be accounted for because accommodations are cost effective. Some of the work that the Job Accommodation Network has done reports a return on investment of $30 to $40 for every dollar that is invested in an accommodation. So there again, the idea of the productivity enhancer. So accommodations help retain employees, they curb turnover, they improve productivity and efficiency. And if we only think about turnover, turnover is incredibly expensive, even for entry-level positions. So thinking about the cost to recruit, to hire, to train and onboard a new employee is quite significant. And providing an accommodation can help retain a talented employee. Accommodations also extend to these less tangible outcomes. The benefits of accommodations improve morale, job satisfaction, commitment, of course for the worker whose needs are met, but also these benefits also have been shown to spill over to other employees because accommodations really send a strong signal of the kind of employer we work for. When we see a coworker's need being met, it sends a strong signal that our own needs would also be met in a similar situation. And so here are a lot of resources on the how-tos of accommodation. Of course, if somebody hires in partnership with an organization like CCRW, there can be some built-in support there. I've alluded to this earlier on. The Job Accommodation Network has this searchable online accommodation resource library where users can search by disability or functional limitation. For folks joining us from Canada, the Canadian Human Rights Commission offers a series of webinars, I believe there's 5 of them, on the accommodation process. And the nice thing about these webinars is that they're also accompanied by a set of case studies that have been designed to help employers think through accommodation cases and practice. And so again, these webinars and the associated case studies could be used in a training and development activity for your department. If the need for information is on the regulatory front, the Disability Rights Education and Defend Fund lists relevant laws around the world. And finally, if the questions are around, well, are there any financial incentives or subsidies? Here are a couple of links. The first one for Canada, the second one for US employers. And then I have to highlight an upcoming webinar on this channel by WWDPI, a whole webinar on financial incentives. And I believe this is coming up in a few weeks. The webinar is led by Drs. Rebecca Gewirtz and Emil Tompa. Okay, so the last portion of the employment process I wanted to cover focuses on performance management. And the myth at this step can be essentially summarized as follows. The myth here is that employees with disabilities are poor performers, more likely to be absent, more likely to turn over. And again, you'll see a pattern. We're busting myths today. Again, this myth is not supported by the research evidence. Coletta and colleagues conducted a very clever study in distribution centers. These were distribution centers that had multiple locations. It was done in the US. And this employer was quite inclusive of folks with disabilities. And Coletta now partner with the employer to study productivity across the distribution centers. The most common finding was that there was no difference in productivity across distribution centers between employees with and without a lived experience of a disability. But when performance differences were found, employees with disabilities performed better, and they also showed lower turnover rates. In the same study, Coletta and colleagues also reported lower rates of serious workplace accidents and injuries. But one thing that I want to point out, my colleague Arif Jetha and his colleagues Breslin, Lay, and Smith have done work showing that workers with disabilities may be more vulnerable when work environments are unsafe. And so when there are psychologically or physically unsafe work environments. And of course, these are work environments that employers should work very hard to eliminate, but we do know that they exist. And in fact, because of the employment landscape, employees with disabilities are often overrepresented in these precarious work conditions. Hernandez and McDonald in a white paper, this one's a few years old, 2007, but it still has really valuable information. They found no differences in need for supervision. But I think the best paper that really kind of caps this myth off and busts it effectively is the Lindsay and colleague systematic review. A systematic review entails a very careful reading of the literature to provide an exhaustive summary of the evidence speaking to a very specific research question. And their research question was looking at the benefits of inclusive hiring on the bottom line of the organization, specifically focused on inclusive hiring of people with disabilities. And Lindsay and colleague went through the literature in a very, very fine-grained comb, or fine-tooth comb, and found benefits at the organizational level in terms of outcomes like improved company image, a more diverse customer base, greater customer loyalty, greater customer satisfaction, greater innovation, and better productivity. And these are outcomes that all employers care about. And looking at employees, echoing many of the findings that we've discussed so far in the webinar, Lindsay and colleagues found decreased turnover and improved retention, improved employee loyalty and commitment and satisfaction, and so on. Again, these are outcomes that every business cares about. And so the bottom line is that inclusive hiring is good for business. Inclusive hiring benefits businesses, and it benefits the business's own employees. So my last set of practical tips on the next two slides. Inviting everybody joining us to reflect on the benefits of hiring, developing, and retaining talent in an inclusive manner. So 3 links to toolkits to make the business case, toolkits to encourage retention, the business case of why hiring by Odin Network. More than this, one of the things that I'd really like to see more of are conversations, conversation hours, for examples, or panel sessions put on, roundtable discussions at chambers of commerce meetings, at business alliance meetings, at industry conferences. It's important to share success stories. Success begets success. Sharing these stories in conversation hours and roundtables helps employers share what they've learned, have discussions around concerns, and hear from other businesses in our own industry, similar size, and talk about the learnings that you've had. If performance problems appear, as they might do with any employee, engaging in performance management proactively, as you would do with every employee. Proactive performance management means focusing on regular performance feedback, reviewing the clarity of instructions, any training, right, making sure that there's no ambiguity around what needs to be done and how that work needs to be carried out. And then working collaboratively on identifying and adjusting any accommodations, but not assuming that the disability is the cause of the performance problem. So approaching the performance management as one would with any employee, proactively, collaboratively, and with a problem-solving and collaborative mindset. And the last reflection exercise that I'd like to invite you to engage in is this website, benchmarkability.org. This is a self-assessment tool developed by researchers at Cornell University. And it helps employers reflect on their practices on these 6 different areas of inclusive hiring, specifically focused on lived experiences of disability. So recruitment and hiring, career development and retention, accessibility and accommodation, compensation and benefits, diversity and inclusion, metrics and analytics. And the self-assessment tool will provide a tailored report on areas of strengths as well as areas of potential development and change in practices. And so it's quite a wonderful resource that is available and that employers can avail themselves of. So that's, I believe, all the time for this portion of the webinar. I just want to do just very quick acknowledgements. Again, the research that we do at the Canadian Disability Participation Project is supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and we're very grateful for the support that allows us to do this work. And for anybody joining who would have an interest in learning more about the CDPP, here is our website for any additional research report, resources, and information about our work. So thank you so much for your participation. I believe Maureen has been moderating questions and collecting them for this time in the webinar.
Exactly. Well, Silvia, thank you so much. This has been an incredible presentation. Really wonderful to have some stats and some research behind what we often do, I think, anecdotally. So thank you very, very much. Unfortunately, I think we've run out of time. There have been some excellent questions asked, but what we will do is we will send these to Silvia and ask you to answer them, and they will be posted along with this webinar. So with that, I'll put it back to Yusra. Again, though, Silvia, absolutely phenomenal. Thank you so very much.
You're welcome, and I look forward to getting the questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Silvia, for this extremely informative webinar, and also for providing us with a list of valuable resources. Really, really interesting, and for talking about all these misconceptions and myths around the recruitment of people with disabilities. So thank you very much, and thank you, Maureen, for making the time to co-moderate this webinar. It's always great to have you online, so thank you very, very much, both of you. And to our audience,